we can start. So hello and welcome everyone. I am Mahmoud Jawadi and I'm honored to be moderating today's webinar. I hope you can hear me loud and clear, but please let us know in the chat box in case you have audio issues or any technical difficulties. So the webinar is organized and brought to you by European Guanxi, established in Barcelona in September 2020. European Guanxi is a non-profit organization that aims to create a network of empowered young European professionals, scholars, and students who strive to influence the dynamics of the EU-China relationship in all aspects. To stay updated on European Guanxi's activities, events, podcasts, and publications, please follow us on mainstream social media platforms such as LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram, just by typing European Guanxi. Today, I'm delighted and honored to have conversation with Noah Barking regarding the current states and the future trajectories of EU's China strategy. Mr. Barking is widely known and respected in the field. Many dedicated researchers and scholars of EU-China relations follow his immensely insightful newsletter, Watching China in Europe. He's a senior advisor in Rhodium Group's China practice based in Berlin, where he focuses on Europe-China relations and transatlantic China policy. Additionally, Mr. Barking serves as a visiting senior fellow in the Indo-Pacific program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, where the popular Watching China in Europe newsletter is hosted. Prior to his current roles, he worked as a bureau chief, regional editor, and Europe correspondent for Reuters, with postings in Berlin, Paris, London, and New York. He has also contributed to prominent publications such as The Atlantic, the New York Times, Foreign Policy and Political, as well as leading European media outlets. I highly recommend following Mr. Barking on Twitter as he provides valuable updates and comments on EU-China relations. Before we begin our conversations, I would like to briefly elaborate and clarify the title of the webinar, Demystifying the EU's China Policy 2.0. Well, the upcoming EU Leaders Summit on June 29th will prominently feature EU-China relations as a topic of discussion. Additionally, as you might know, an informal meeting of EU foreign ministers in Sweden last week addressed the issue. High Representative Borrell has submitted a 7-page China paper to the EU foreign ministers on behalf of the European External Action Service. And Mr. Borrell confirmed during the press conference after the Gimnich meeting that the ministers welcomed the paper and expressed their agreement and consent on the fundamental principles of the EU's attempts to recalibrate its China strategy. In 2019, the EU described its vision towards China as a somewhat vague triptych, a partner for cooperation and negotiation, an economic competitor, and a systemic rival. Mr. Borrell stated last week as well that the EU will continue with this triptych as he believes it accurately reflects the reality. China is a rival, partner, and competitor. While the concept of decoupling and de-risking have dominated the discourse on the EU's China policy, it appears that EU leaders will prioritize de-risking. However, there are concerns regarding the characterization of China as a partner, competitor, and rival, as well as uncertainties regarding the feasibility of de-risking, especially given the EU's ambitions to achieve strategic autonomy. On this note, which I acknowledge not everyone agrees with, our aim is to comprehend and appraise the evolving EU-China strategy. It is important to clarify that we do not intend to discuss the recent China paper in detail, as it is not publicly available, although certain key elements of it have been reported by media. In this webinar, our goal is to present a normative argument for what the EU's new China policy should entail. We will explore the extent to which the emerging concept of de-risking is relevant to the daily interaction between Brussels and Beijing, and examine how it aligns with the competitor, partner, rival triptych. There are numerous ideas to discuss And I think that Mr. Barking agrees with me, and I eagerly anticipate Mr. Barking's valuable insights on these matters. But before I pass the floor to Noah Barking, I go over a few housekeeping rules for the audience. Well, please turn off your camera and microphone during the conversation. Utilize the chat box to share your questions and comments, and I will strive to address them all. Of course, with the support and assistance of my colleagues and friends, Ardita and Emily from the European Guanxi. In the Q&A sections, please use the raise hand function if you wish to personally contribute your questions or comments. And please be aware that the entire webinar, including the Q&A section, will be recorded and later posted on YouTube and other social media platforms. Without any further delay, Mr. Barking, we're all ears, eager to hear your insights on the pivotal questions. What should constitute the key elements of the EU's new China and EU's new policy towards China?
Well, Mahmoud, thank you for the very kind introduction, and thanks to European Guanxi for organizing this and inviting me. I think I'll perhaps start off with a few remarks about where we've come and where we are, and hopefully leave a lot of time for questions and exchange with the audience. I think we've been on if you look back and sort of take a step back, look at the past years, we've been, I think over the past 6 or 7 years, on a trajectory in which European relations with China have been deteriorating, heading in the wrong direction. I think this started with a debate about European economic competitiveness, Chinese companies coming into Europe and buying up companies, strategic assets here, the Made in China 2025 strategy. But over the past years, it has quickly morphed into something bigger, something more strategic. As you mentioned, the EU now uses the term systemic rivalry along with competitor and partner to describe the relationship with China. And I think we're at a pivotal moment. We've come out of a period where China was pretty much locked down, fairly isolated from the world because of Beijing's zero COVID policy. That ended fairly abruptly at the end of last year, and that has led to a number of changes. European leaders are now traveling to Beijing, meeting with Xi Jinping. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz was the first back in November. And we all saw the recent trip by Emmanuel Macron and Ursula von der Leyen, and I think it's natural that because all of a sudden European leaders are traveling to Beijing, meeting with Chinese interlocutors, and of course we also have Chinese diplomats coming to Europe on a regular basis, that this sort of cacophony, the different voices in Europe are coming to the surface again. So I think for a period of time during the pandemic, we had a fairly united Europe and a sort of a united message when it came to China. Now we're hearing a lot of different voices. I think it's important to note that Germany, which has I think the closest economic relationship with China, obviously Europe's biggest economy, we've had a bit of a void here because the government is quite divided on China policy, with the Greens, members of the German coalition, pushing for a much harder line, the Chancellor Olaf Scholz and his team a bit more risk averse and keen not to rock the boat too much at a time when there's a war raging in Europe. So this German void, the increasingly tense relationship between Washington and Beijing. It was good to see Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, meeting with Wang Yi in Vienna last week, because for months before that, there had been very little communication between the US and China in the aftermath of this balloon incident. So I think with all these voices in Europe, with the tensions between the US and China gathering momentum, and with this void really from Berlin, where I think Europe, I think other countries in Europe really looking to Germany for to point the direction on China to a certain extent. I think with all of this happening, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen felt the need to give what I thought was a very important speech on March 30th, where she proposed the EU putting together an economic security strategy. She used the term de-risking, and that term has now been adopted. I think we may find it in the G7 communique later this month when the G7 leaders meet in Hiroshima, Japan. We heard U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan use this term in his recent speech at the Brookings Institution in Washington. So what we're seeing now is a kind of convergence around a common language. I think we've all been haunted by the term decoupling for many years now. This is a term that obviously some people in the Trump administration used, but it's not a term that the Biden administration has ever used. But it lives on, and also as a bit of a straw man here in Europe, where you hear a lot of politicians saying we don't want decoupling. I don't think there are too many people pushing for a decoupling, or too many people who think that a sort of a complete economic disengagement from China is a possibility. I think this is fanciful, but there was a need to kind of reframe the debate a bit, and I think that's what von der Leyen has tried to do. I think the key, what we're looking for over the coming months, the Commission is putting together a communication on economic security that's supposed to come out about a week before the next European Council at the end of June, and I think the key thing to look at here is the question of Europe's economic and technological relationship with China and where the red lines are there. I think Europe has not really defined those red lines, or even attempted to define them. This is obviously a very complex task. We get into the details of semiconductors and artificial intelligence and quantum computing. So I think the US has really been at the forefront here, and Europe has been in sort of reactive defensive mode. We saw the export controls that were introduced on October 7th of last year on advanced semiconductor tools. This was announced in Washington. Now the U.S., Japan, and the Netherlands have reached an agreement to move move together on this. But Europe really needs to define its own strategy, and that there may be some overlap with the United States. but Europe needs to be in a position where it can also sit down with the table with its allies in Washington, Tokyo, and elsewhere, and have a position that it can promote and try to convince its allies to move in its direction. So we're facing, I think, a very pivotal few months in the run-up to this European Council, and I'm going to be watching very closely how this economic security strategy comes together, how the big member states like Germany and France position themselves. Do they support von der Leyen in her endeavor? And of course, we'll be watching how China reacts. China has said that de-risking, I think Xi Jinping said this to Ursula von der Leyen when she was in Beijing, de-risking is just another term for decoupling. So China is not thrilled about this de-risking push by Europe, but my sense is it's here to stay, and it's just about defining what it really means. So I will stop there and pass it back to you, Mahmoud.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Noah. I have one fundamental question, and it stems from Borrell's speech 2 days ago. He said that China in 2023 is not China in 2019. But at the same time, Borrell advocates that triptych that China is a partner, a competitor, a rival. And this formula and this vision holds true in 2019, but at the same time in 2023. How can we understand that despite the fact that the EU recognized the difference in terms of Chinese assertiveness from 2019 until now, but the vision remains intact?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think people in Brussels are not, certainly in the European External Action Service, are not keen to give up this holy trinity of partner, competitor, and systemic rival, because it's, of course, it's very broad, but it also, I think the feeling is, holds the EU 27 together. And obviously there are big differences within the EU in terms of how they see China. I would say that we've had a great deal of convergence within Europe on how Europe should be interacting with China over the past years. But you have a country like Hungary on the one side, which is pursues a close relationship with China, in part to use it as leverage against its European partners. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have a country like Lithuania, which has pushed back very forcefully, left the 16+1 grouping roughly a year ago or more. And then you have all the countries in between, and Germany has a very close economic relationship with China. France plays a security role in the region. They all see it through different prisms, I think. So the triptych sort of keeps everyone together. So I don't think we're going to see the end of that anytime soon. But of course, the relationship has changed significantly over the past few years. We've had Hong Kong, China's national security law, the crackdown in Hong Kong. We've had more reports about what is happening in Xinjiang and the human rights violations against the Uyghur population there. We had the exchange of sanctions back in March 2021, which essentially killed the comprehensive agreement on investment that the EU and China had sealed. At least there was a political agreement at the end of 2020. And of course, I think the big the big shift has been since the war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China's support for Russia. One can call it perhaps a pro-Russian neutrality. That's how some people describe it. But in the recent paper that Burrell and his team prepared for the debate among European foreign ministers, they were very clear that they see China supporting Russia. China has not condemned the invasion, and they said that the relationship in this paper, that the relationship between the EU and China would be critically affected, were the words, if China did not push Russia to withdraw from Ukraine, and we haven't seen any signs that that is going to happen. So I would say we may be at the point soon where this triptych will no longer be defensible. I think if we saw China arming Russia, for example, if we saw any aggression from the Chinese side vis-a-vis Taiwan in the run-up to the Taiwanese elections next January, it would become more difficult, I think, to describe China as a partner. And even in the area of climate, where I think Europe is very keen to work together with China. China is, of course, the biggest emitter in the world. The climate relationship is also becoming much more one of competition and dependencies and de-risking. So we'll see how long this triptych lives on. For the moment, they are sticking with it. But I do know that people around European Commission President von der Leyen already think it's time to move on from this. And I think that debate will continue in the months ahead.
Great. And well, I think that, and I believe that the paper or the new strategy aims to generate or draw a common denominator or make convergence between different and diverse policies of each and every member states. And I think, and I believe, for example, the Netherlands has a very strict export control vis-a-vis China, but maybe other countries, as you make an example, that maybe have less restrictive measures against China. Do you think that this paper is capable to serve all interests and priorities of member states, or it can be, frankly speaking, it's just another paper with no tangible actions and outcome?
Well, I think the paper that was presented to European foreign ministers at the end of last week is more a description of the current state of play. It's not, there's no action plan. There are some recommendations about how Europe should present itself vis-a-vis China. But I think I think what will be more interesting is this communication coming out of the Commission next month on economic security, because then we're going to really get into the policies that Europe will have to consider over the coming months. The EU has built up a pretty formidable toolbox, as it calls it, with all sorts of instruments. We have a new anti-coercion instrument, foreign subsidies instrument, which went into effect at the beginning of this year, and I think we'll see the Commission beginning to implement that in the latter half of this year. We have a procurement instrument. Obviously, we have an FDI screening regime. So I think the key things to look at in this economic security strategy, first of all, it's about supply chains and resilience. It's about access to critical minerals. It's about reducing dependencies on China, and this is not going to happen overnight. This has to be a sort of a long-term plan. The Commission came out in March with its Critical Raw Materials Act. So that's one part. There's also critical infrastructure, which, running from everything from 5G to ports. Europe doesn't have a port strategy. China has some stakes in numerous large ports, and we had a big debate here in Germany over the sale of a stake in a terminal at the Hamburg port to Chinese shipping giant COSCO, in which German Chancellor Olaf Scholz overruled half a dozen of his ministers and pushed this deal through. So critical infrastructure is another part of it. I think critical infrastructure and supply chain resilience are not so controversial. I think Russia's war in Ukraine has heightened the sensitivity to infrastructure vulnerabilities, including in Germany, despite the COSCO decision. I think where it's going to get very interesting is on the technology relationship with China. I talked about the export controls that the US introduced back in October. I think on export control policy, we have a debate in Europe right now. We have a debate at the G7 level about how to coordinate better on export controls and where to draw the line in terms of what technologies can and should be controlled. And then we're at the beginning of a big debate over outbound investment restrictions. We're expecting, we're expecting an executive order from the White House, I think in the coming months on this. And von der Leyen has proposed doing this, looking at this in Europe as well. So there's a lot of resistance to this idea, but I think in the coming months we will be seeing how the big member states feel about this issue, and so it'll be very interesting to see whether the EU pursues this path. I think the US is certainly pushing its allies to follow suit, and I think we'll see in the G7 communique later this month some support among G7 countries to look into this. But imposing restrictions on investments for companies here in Europe investing in China is something that is it's going to be a heavy lift. I think there's a lot of resistance to it.
Okay, so you talk about and you touched upon de-risking and decoupling, and I think that right now the current mood focuses on de-risking within the EU bubble and also the EU Commission. Well, recently we witnessed the discontinuation of the so-called 14+1 initiative, and also, for example, Italy's reluctance to renew the MOU MOU for the Belt and Road Initiative. So these are two recent developments with respect to EU-China relations, which suggest somehow negative developments. And do you think that these developments, among other developments and policies and actions, somehow align with de-risking?
Well, I think the 17+1, then 16+1, now 14+1 format hasn't really been effective for some time. I think there were a lot of hopes in Eastern Europe back when this initiative was started back in 2012, I think, that this was going to lead to heavy Chinese investment in the region, that it was going to increased trade between Eastern European countries and China, and in actual fact, it hasn't really delivered. So a lot of countries in the region have given up on this format. There are still some true believers. I think Hungary, Serbia, perhaps Greece fall into this category. So I don't expect that to disappear completely, but it's that format is really sort of comatose right now, a bit like the comprehensive agreement on investment. And I think it's the result of the difficult issues that the relationship has been going through. I talked about them. I think China's coercion against Lithuania for its embrace of closer relations with Taiwan was a factor there, and certainly China's reputation in Eastern Europe since the war in Ukraine started has deteriorated even more. So if we look at the BRI MOU, I don't think there are similarities there with 14+1. Not a lot has happened in the China-Italy economic relationship since this BRI MOU was signed back in 2019. You have a new government in Italy that is reconsidering it. I think it needs to decide by the end of the year. There have been some pretty strong signals in the past weeks that the government of Prime Minister Meloni is considering dropping this MOU. So I think I don't know if these are necessarily perhaps they fit into the de-risking basket, but I think what they really show is that China has not delivered on these relationships, whether it's the 14+1 or the BRI MOU with Italy. It has not. These relationships with China have not led to great economic benefits for these countries, and at the same time, the relationship with China has deteriorated for many other reasons. So these formats are becoming, in a way, obsolete.
And I think that also recently the topic of sanctions, somehow extraterritorial sanctions against China or Chinese companies and other companies, for example, for Russia or Iran, that have been involved in funding and also supporting Russia in the war in Ukraine, has been resurfaced. So could you elaborate on the feasibility of that and any implications or repercussions that these sanctions may have on the future trajectory of bilateral relations between the EU and China? And I think that some countries have some hesitancy or do not agree with such sanctions.
Yes, well, there have been reports that Europe is considering taking some measures because essentially what we've seen is European goods that are not allowed to go to Russia under the European sanctions against Russia are somehow getting in to Russia. We saw some. We saw the EU using its sanctions tools in the recent sanctions packages against Iran, against entities in Iran, for diverting products into Russia. And I think this is the case with the Chinese entities that we're talking about. I think it's about European products being diverted into Russia through Chinese entities. I don't think we have the full story here, the full information. I think it's an important signal to China that Europe is watching very closely that to ensure that whether it's military goods or anything that can be used, surveillance equipment that can be used on a battlefield, that they are watching, and they want to make sure that there is no circumvention of the sanctions that they've imposed on Russia. Whether we get to a point where we have European sanctions against Chinese entities, I think it's important to acknowledge here these would not be sanctions against China, against the Chinese government or anything like that. I think it would be very targeted sanctions against certain Chinese entities, companies. Some of these companies are already on US sanctions lists. So whether we get that, there have been reports that Germany is reluctant to go ahead with this plan. We'll have to see if these sanctions are actually put in place, but I think it is important to send a signal to Beijing that Europe is watching this very closely, and that it will act if it feels that Chinese companies or actors are complicit in helping Russia circumvent the sanctions. So I think the signal that it sends, even if these sanctions aren't put into place, is important. If Chinese entities are involved, if there's proof that they are involved in this sanction circumvention, then the EU shouldn't hesitate to put sanctions in place. But this is a debate which has just started. We'll have to see how it evolves in the weeks ahead.
Okay, so maybe we can move to the US, EU, China triangle. And I ask just my colleague Ardita, because we have a survey for our audience and somehow feeds to our discussion. And the question is about the EU's policy vis-a-vis China and the United States. And if Ardita could kindly share the survey. Yeah, I mean, just audience, just choose one of the statements that they think is a trap for Europe. Well, I think, after visiting China, the French president had a very controversial interview and conversation with the media. And he stated about trap for Europe, and he somehow raised some controversy. Well, certainly the second one is Macron's points, but I would like to know your opinion. Whether can we add to these list of statements? Do you think that maybe we should have number 3 or even number 4 as statements? And all in all, how do you understand, how do you interpret EU, US-China relations, particularly with respect to the systematic rivalry that the European Union and Mr. Joseph Borrell has repeatedly emphasized and stressed on?
Well, I think the most important message here is that I think Europe should be acting in its own interests vis-a-vis China. I think sometimes there's a temptation in Europe to want to sit on the sidelines and say there's a US-China competition going on. We don't want to get involved, or we don't want to get pulled into it. I think that's the wrong way to look at it. I think there is, of course, a US-China competition, confrontation, which is intensifying. We hope that that both Beijing and Washington are able to manage this competition, but Europe is not being pulled into this by the U.S. We have seen the U.S. Putting pressure on Europe in certain areas. 5G comes to mind, but I think Europe should be viewing the relationship with China through its own, through the prism of its own interests, and the steps that Europe has taken, whether it's sanctions against individuals in Xinjiang, whether it's taking China to the WTO over its coercion against Lithuania, whether it's introducing these instruments, the anti-coercion instrument and all that. This is all in Europe's interest. And I think one of the things that annoys European officials more than anything these days is when they sit down with their Chinese interlocutors and who tell them, you're just following orders from the U.S. That is not the case. The EU is taking these measures because because it is concerned about the relationship with China. It is concerned about China's weaponizing of interdependence, its history of using economic coercion to achieve its political aims and silence other countries on issues that it finds important, whether it's Taiwan or whether it's the origins of the COVID-19 virus. So it's important to understand that Europe is not a helpless actor on the sidelines of a major confrontation between the U.S. and China. Europe is part of this, and it's acting in its own interest when it introduces these instruments and pushes back against China. I think there is concern in Europe about the intensity of the competition between the U.S. and China. I mentioned the balloon incident earlier, and I mentioned the fact that I think communications had largely broken down for months between Beijing and Washington until Jake Sullivan met with Wang Yi in Vienna last week. So Europe is watching this. People in Europe are watching this with a great deal of concern. Nobody wants a military conflict, and it's going to be very important to manage this relationship, the U.S.-China relationship. We're heading into an election year in the U.S., and that usually is not very conducive to an easing of tensions. We have members of Congress. We have a new select committee on China in the House of Representatives that is pushing a very hawkish line, and I think the Biden administration is under a bit of pressure not to slow roll any measures against China. But Europe can play a role there. Europe is talking with China, as we mentioned, and so Europe can play a role in passing on messages to Beijing that Washington at the moment isn't able to pass on, whether it's about tensions in the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea, or whether it's about the war in Ukraine. So I think Ursula von der Leyen is trying to build a bit of a bridge to Washington on the de-risking front, on the economic security front. But Europe will have its own policy towards China. It shouldn't be implementing U.S. policy one for one. It should be developing its own strategy and then sitting down with its partners, whether it's the U.S. or the Japanese or other partners in the world, and trying to work out a collective strategy which protects their own interests, is not provocative and overly confrontational, but defends Europe's interests.
And also you see the result of the survey that 58% of the respondents endorse Mr. Macron's viewpoints, and 42% believe that Europe should side with the United States on matters concerning China. And I think that somehow is a nice experiment from our audience and their understanding of the developments vis-a-vis the triangle of EU, China, and the United States. Well, I think that maybe we can open the floor for comments and questions from our audience. Please write down your comments or questions in the chat box. At the same time, feel free just to turn on your camera and microphone, expressing your words, your opinions, and your questions, but please use the raise hand function. But I received a question from audience, and it's about rare earths, and I just, it's great to have your take on this. So what's the impact of the new EU Critical Raw Materials Act on EU rare earth dependency on China? And I know that you touched upon this point, but if you can somehow elaborate on that point, that would be great.
Sure. Well, the Critical Raw Materials Act is all about reducing Europe's dependencies, and these dependencies for raw materials are have a lot to do with China. Europe is very dependent on raw materials like lithium. Dependent on China for raw materials like lithium, cobalt that go into green technologies, EV batteries, etc. So Europe has come up with a long-term plan to reduce these dependencies, and that involves reaching out to countries in Latin America, in Africa. We've seen German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, for example, traveling. He was in Africa about a week ago, and he's also traveled to Brazil, Argentina, Chile in recent months. So I think the Europeans are trying to reach out to those countries that have these minerals, and they're hoping to create new partnerships with them. Often Chinese companies extract the minerals, let's say, in African countries, send them back to China for refining, and then export them to the rest of the world. I think Europe wants to take a different approach and try to set up more win-win, to use a Chinese term, relationships with these countries and do the refining in the countries themselves, rather than sending them home and refining them there. So this is a strategy which is going to take quite a long time to put in place. There are hurdles to it. You know, some of it involves the kind of mining activities that I think many Europeans are averse to. So because they're environmentally damaging. So Europe is trying to sort of square that circle. China has been reaching out to these countries in the global south, as they are called sometimes, for many years, and is firmly established in Africa, for example. So Europe and the US and other countries are playing catch up here. So we'll have to see whether this works. I think in terms of rare earths, China controls something like 90% of the world market, but these rare earths can be located elsewhere and refined and So this is a long-term process of sort of reducing that dependencies, which is starting now.
Okay, and also the second question that we received from the audience is back to our discussions on US-China, EU relations, and as you mentioned about the election year. So the question is what's the relationship between EU, US, China, and how it's going to be shaped if Trump or incarnation of Trump will just assume power in the United States?
Well, that is the nightmare scenario for a lot of people in Europe. Also, quite a few people in the United States. I think we'll have to cross that bridge when we come to it. Obviously, if we get an administration in the United States that is more hostile to Europe, as the Trump administration was, that perhaps is not as supportive of Ukraine in pushing back against Russian aggression, that is going to fundamentally change the transatlantic relationship. I think Europe may suddenly find itself in a position where it needs to do much more to support Ukraine. I'm not sure if Europe is in a position to, in fact, I know that Europe is not in a position to fill the gaps that would be left by the US retreating from that conflict. I think the Biden administration is very keen, with an election looming at the end of 2024, to find a peaceful solution to the conflict before the election takes place, because the Biden administration is on the defensive, under attack by some members of the opposition, some Republicans who think the U.S. Should not be investing as much as it is in defending Ukraine. If we look at the relationship with China, I think if we have a Republican administration, that is probably going to lead to more confrontation between the US and China. I think it's not only always appreciated, but the Biden administration, even though it has, I think, what everyone would describe as a pretty tough policy towards China, has been very cognizant of trying to limit the possible escalation in that relationship. For example, it hasn't released the details of its investigation into the Chinese balloon. And we know that it has sort of slow-rolled some other policies in order to encourage Beijing to talk again. I think you would have a more confrontational administration when it comes to China policy if the Republicans were to come back into office. I think for Europe, that would probably lead to more hedging, but I don't think it changes the fundamentals of the EU-China relationship, and that is that China remains a systemic rival in many ways. It will make life more difficult for all US allies, I think, but I don't think it changes the fundamental dynamics of the EU-China relationship.
I think that we have 5 minutes and a couple of more questions. So I got questions from Nick Reiners, and if I pronounce your name correctly. Well, it's about actually, so I just read the questions. Do you think Germany will eventually side closer to the US or continue to sit on the fence in its China strategy? For example, do you think Berlin will eventually order a complete removal of Huawei equipment from the 5G network?
Yeah, well, I think Germany has moved quite a bit over the past years, and this government is deeply divided. But I think Olaf Scholz, who has taken quite a cautious approach, I think if you saw the messages that he conveyed when he was in Beijing at his press conference, he was quite open about the problems in the relationship with China. I think he is fully on board with Ursula von der Leyen's de-risking strategy. Scholz often talks about reducing dependencies on China, about boosting resilience. So this is very different language than we heard from Angela Merkel, his predecessor. And there is a debate about removing Huawei from the German 5G network. The situation there is that Germany delayed making decisions for so long that the telecommunications operators continued to deploy Huawei gear in the 5G network in Germany. In the radio access network, I think Huawei represents 60% of the network. So that is a huge task. I think removing Huawei will take many years, but I think we could have a decision at some point later this year that would put Germany on the path to removing Huawei from the network. We'll have to see. I think we may get some news before the summer.
Excellent. And two more questions. One is about regarding what we see with the Netherlands and ASML, where the export of semiconductor machines to China are being restricted. And the question is that wouldn't it be more advantageous to decide this in Brussels at the EU level?
Yes. Well, I was just in The Hague last week, and there is a debate about more coordination at European level on export controls. Export controls have traditionally been in the hands of the member states. We did have a new dual-use export control regulation, which went into effect in 2021, which opens the door to a bit more coordination at the European level. It allows one member state to take an export control to its EU partners, and its EU partners can then implement that same control. And I think we're going to see the Netherlands doing something like this with the semiconductor controls. But there is still a lot of resistance in countries like the Netherlands, in Germany, in France, to giving the Commission too much power over decisions which they feel are national security decisions. So more coordination, yes. More powers to Brussels. I'm skeptical about whether that is going to happen anytime soon.
And the last questions from Victor, I think that it takes maybe another sessions, but somehow asking how China perceives EU and about the discourse of China regarding, over the last years, and can you perceive any changes on how China talks about the EU? But well, just China, maybe in 1 minute.
Yeah. China has been on what people are calling a charm offensive with Europe. I think China's nightmare is that Europe sides with the US and continues to implement measures like we saw in the Netherlands with ASML. So what we've heard in recent discussions, there's a lot of concern in Beijing about European de-risking policy, export controls, more restrictions on outbound investments, restrictions on technology transfers. So there's a lot of concern, and Beijing is reaching out to the Europeans, inviting European leaders to Beijing, sending diplomats to Europe. But on the issues that are really core to Europe, including Ukraine, we haven't seen much movement from China. So this charm offensive until now has been fairly empty. The Europeans are pressing, obviously, Beijing to deliver on a number of issues that are of concern to them, but we'll have to see. So far, there's been no movement, just a willingness to talk on the Chinese side.
Fantastic. I do appreciate your contribution and sharing your illuminating insights with us. I think that we had a wide-ranging conversation, but so many things have been left unnoticed and discussed, and I hope that in another occasion we can discuss. But again, thank you so much for your availability and also your contributions. And also I am extremely grateful to our audience for their participation and contributions, and to the European Guanxi team for giving me this opportunity, and also Ardita and Emily for supporting me in organizing this webinar. Once again, Noah, thank you so much for your time and also your insights, and I look forward to your newsletter. And I do recommend all audience and participants and viewer of this video just to sign up for Noah Barkin's newsletter, Watching China in Europe.
Mahmoud, thanks so much for having me. Really good to talk to you. Great questions, and I look forward to coming back.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone. Have a good day.